So it's my pleasure to introduce Skye Moret. Skye is a data-driven designer and marine scientist. She has a BS in biology from Oregon State University and an M.F.A. in information design from Northeastern. Her dual passions for art and science have taken her all over the world, including Antarctica. And she is currently chair of the M.F.A. Collaborative Design and M.A. Design Systems programs at Pacific Northwest College of Art at Willamette University. I'm really excited to hear her talk to us today about data visualization as visceralization.
Thanks so much, Amanda. So today, I'm excited to speak with you all about, one of the, I think the most passionate, the aspect of data visualization that I'm most excited about, coming from kind of a life at sea and transitioning into design and really thinking about instruments like data visualization, data encoding that can bring us all together around kind of existential topics now, but also anything we're curious about in the natural world. So, I spent, I don't know, decades, at least 100,000 miles at sea, working on sailboats, teaching students oceanography, which is incredibly interdisciplinary from a science perspective, integrating that with cultures and from island cultures down to Antarctica, which is very much a scientific culture. And in doing all of this, how I communicated to people about the ocean was very different from their mental model, right? They think of the ocean as perhaps not even like this Google map having any water in it. We don't know what it looks like, much less what questions to ask, because 70% of the planet is kind of encoded in this way. And thinking about what media we have access to are how we are able to ask scientific questions, or even be able to have any access to scientific discourse if we're not a domain expert can be very difficult. So just to preface, I've always, I call myself much more of a designer, but I've always been interested in, are there ways, including trying out watercolors, seeing if I can paint the ocean every day when I'm on a cruise down to Antarctica and back, showing off that how different even the watercolor is as you're transitioning down to across the Southern Ocean, along the Drake Passage and back. In doing those kinds of cruises, even explaining to people that no, this is not this level like cruise where you're like braced against the side of the vessel and everything is shaking and it's incredibly, everything is always, the boat is rolling all the time. And, and showing people kind of explaining how, what my experience is, which is what they want to know. I don't show them, these are the kind of weather maps that we get down there every day. That's like, you can expect, these giant, it looks like 22-foot seas, coming your way tomorrow. Most of the time I, show them Polaroids, or I'm showing them something I ultimately end up posting to Instagram, or, something that is a bit more experiential. And, even I've been thinking a lot about, well, how do we connect the scientific world to the experiential aspect? And something I know that I don't know much about, but is super exciting, right, is Aurora Borealis or Aurora Australis. And if you look, sure enough, at scientific literature, you see, how scientists are talking to each other about this is very different than, when we go to Iceland or we go to somewhere, in the Southern Hemisphere, and we see this amazing magical array. It doesn't even matter if we understand it. We care about it and we want to experience this. And so how do we take these aspects of wonder and combine them with kind of the maxims of scientific, effective communication? And so, there's several papers over the years focusing on kind of what does good effective communication really mean? And there's these 5 maxims of, quality. Is it accurate? Is this something that people should know about? Is this too much information? How much information should we actually explain from domain experts to non-experts? Is it relevant to them? Is it something they need to know? How do we not use jargon? How do we have nice manners to make sure people understand our information? And then how do we know that it was effective? And then I'm arguing here in this presentation that we also need the sense of wonder or participatory engagement, even if it's static, that we can use to drive kind of discourse and engagement with these topics. So, when you Google Antarctica, I'm just going to talk about two projects, one about Antarctica, one set in the Southern Ocean and one set in Bali. In Antarctica, you're just, you Google it and you just see these surface photos that are very white, gray, and blue. But when we talk about changing climate and we talk about, especially this area of the world, the Antarctic Peninsula, that's warming the fastest in the entire Southern Hemisphere, most of the life that I've known from, doing 10 cruises down in the Antarctic program, pulling up creatures for science, and it's just like a vast array of color under the water. It's like giant man-sized, yellow sponges and purple sea stars and rays and octopi, and it doesn't look anything like this. So this is a version of Antarctica that perhaps is good for tourism, but is not helping us think about climate change in Antarctica and what colors, and life might exist below the surface. And so I started to think about, for my M.F.A. thesis actually long ago, how I might encode this data. Photographs have such deep, we layer them with so much projected meaning, and they have so much meaning in general. And so I wanted to think about, well, can we use certain aspects of imagery, whether it's texture, shapes, or color in this case, to pull out, to kind of abstract our image and start to get at perhaps color as a proxy for biodiversity and color as a mode of engagement. So we have the sea surface here, and we have images below the surface and above the surface, and we have I took photographs again that I had taken down on the Antarctic Peninsula, 50 that my friend had taken below, and I just subsampled pixels, like picking pages, taking a book page and subsampling letters off of the page, kind of top to bottom, left to right, pulling those pixels and putting them in these vertical pixel bars you see in the middle here. And so I did that for 100 images total, 50 above, 50 below. And at first put that into this static graphic that was published in Popular Science a number of years ago. Just this poster just saying, here's above the surface, here's below. This really highlights the juxtaposition of our expectations of what Antarctica looks like. And perhaps we can start having a conversation of like, yeah, what does live there? And crazy golden trumpetfish live there, what? And we can start having more dialogue. But again, this is an abstracted view completely. I don't even know what these images look like, except for a few examples on the left. And so I really wanted to highlight, to be able to engage people with each individual photograph, more in an installation or a museum setting. The first place was in a gallery. But I created, using a little leap motion, which is a little infrared sensor about the size of your phone, a little half the size of your phone. I created this this interface, gestural interface, where it basically kind of like a mouse on a screen, it maps your hand to the different colored images you see, and it pulls up the photograph that color bar is representative of. And so you're able to raise your hand above the surface, see everything, all the photographs above, kind of bring it down, zoom in, zoom out, and be able to see everything below. So this was shown at Science Gallery Dublin, at the EU Parliament building in Brussels, and then down in Antarctica, I was able to share it with them in 2018. And then I was through Meet the Ocean, a nonprofit, I was able to go to Australia, and we toured a bunch of children's hospitals, and were able to kind of share Antarctica with them in this way. And then my final piece I want to share with you is much more participatory. Again, I was telling you, I did a lot of cruises on the open ocean, and around the time I was sailing a lot in my 20s, I started hearing about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and I had sailed a lot and had done facilitated lots of student projects, specifically looking at plastics. And though we did have plenty of tiny little pieces in our Petri dishes at the end of these kind of daily net tows at the surface, you can see this triggerfish where we caught a bunch of plastic, and this triggerfish by accident, which shouldn't be in the middle of the ocean, they're reef fish. But, filleted the fish open, there's all this plastic in its stomach. And so around the time before it became this ubiquitous topic that everyone knows about, we had started ultimately publishing in a bunch of different journals and a documentary on the bottom right here, a bunch of papers about taking all of these annually repeated cruise tracks year after year. How much plastic is in the ocean was the big question at the time. And these educational cruises that I worked on traveled those same areas, North Atlantic, North Pacific, where these supposed garbage patches, which there is plenty of accumulation, but it's very, very different than how we think about it in the mass media version. And we published these papers, and I had started giving talks about, how much plastic is there, kind of how big is it, what kind is it, how much wind is mixing it down into the water column, started producing educational pieces. But again, as was mentioned in earlier talks, these are all peer-reviewed papers that are very difficult to access. I think the bottom left is the only one that's like openly available to still access. So, excuse me, and thinking about, kind of the mental model in the US, at least, of these hyperbolic kind of visions of a great Pacific garbage patch, a landfill you could walk on in the middle of the ocean, something we can go easily clean up. Most of these pieces are millimeters in size, if not much smaller, 0.05 grams, which is real tiny. And most of the way that we talk to each other in terms of disciplinary discourse between domain experts in plastic debris is what you see on the right here. And so, this is great, but how do we, this is at the time where people were still really starting to form their own opinions based on mass media, and scientists weren't necessarily communicating with them. At the same time, over the last 40 years of kind of the initial marine debris articles, plastic pollution in the ocean, from a scientific publication perspective, to this day, well over 85% of them are still focused on the ocean. But where does plastic pollution actually come from? It comes from rivers and freshwater sources. Certainly there's some from maritime industries, but in terms of thinking about, well, who's responsible? How can we perhaps help mitigate this problem? I've been interested in how can we reframe and re-engage people with this issue. And so this is an image by Lena Klaus, one of my collaborators. National Geographic a few years ago came out with this Open Plastic Innovation Challenge. How do we, they had a couple really cool components that other people were working on. How do we not have waste? How do we have, kind of upcycle and yet not have waste? And how do we perhaps not have petrochemical plastic? Can it be made out of other things? And there was a track focused on data visualization. And my team decided to make a giant data art installation focused on the fate of all plastic ever made on the planet. So instead of just focusing on plastic that ends up in the ocean, kind of let's talk about all plastic ever made. At this point, like 9 billion metric tons. How much is there, where's in the whole world, how much is discarded, which is this white section, 60% often ends up either, in landfills in some countries, or perhaps mismanaged waste that ends up in the environment, rivers, the ocean. And then how much is incinerated, 9%, still in use, 24%, and then the very little that is recycled to this day. And so it ended up being this 14-meter, almost 50-foot diameter data art installation made over the course of weeks of preparation, but all the flip-flops in this case were collected from the beaches in Bali. And Lena Klaus and Moret are my two collaborators on this project and colleagues. We developed it early on based on the scientific article. The publication is, again, still proprietary, it's difficult to access, but it had this original graphic focused on kind of primary production, or kind of initial plastic that's produced and what happens to it. We converted it into a flow diagram or a Sankey diagram, and then everyone loves circles, and it kind of helped with what we were trying to do. We created this semicircle view showing it kind of coming from a river source, which is often where this debris is coming from, and some of it ending up in, as waste for floating marine debris. This high tide hit it a couple times. We fixed it. We got all the plastic back. But this was one project that just really, we ended up winning this Plastic Innovation Challenge, and we're able to make a film about it. And Lena still does this kind of work in Bali, though not most of it's not data driven, but these big art installations that include community cleanup, community involvement. And then most of these pieces get recycled if possible at various locations in Bali. I know they recycle flip-flops in a very certain way. So here's the team, and I just can't say enough about engaging with the tangible aspects of information design. Really think about, can we take the actual, is there a way, or can we collaborate with designers or artists or other thinkers in a way that we can take the actual form of data that we're dealing with, whatever it is, and is there a way to actually kind of visceralize that or make it tangible to people? I know people feel empowered when they, when they can perceive ecosystems in a way that's pretty intuitive. Can you transport me to Antarctica? Can you show me what this much plastic looks like, or show me the scale of an issue by literally with scale? For example, this is me, and this is Lena in this picture. And yeah, if we want people to be actively participate in scientific discourse, we need to involve them in a way that is exciting for them and delightful for them. And so I'll welcome any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Skye. That was such a great talk. I don't think I've seen any questions yet, but I will wait for them to roll in. But in the meantime, it's clear that everyone is super impressed. I'm curious whether you've played with any other sort of sensory experiences to visceralize data, like sound or touch or anything like that.
Yeah, I've done a residency, actually art residency in the Amazon called Lab Verity, if everybody's interested. It's this kind of art meets science in the middle of the jungle, obviously, looking at, I've been thinking about texture and kind of light. I know that's also visual, but thinking about, how we are nostalgic for places, and how does that bring meaning to, I'm here in Oregon in the US, and if I close my eyes, how do I know I'm in Oregon and not the Amazon jungle, and not, what information about the environment is literally entering my mind? Is sound more important in some cases? Is all of the many holes in the leaves everywhere important to me? And so there I was really looking actually at texture of trees in different altitudes, and seeing if through looking at texture, can we start to understand qualities of different foliage there, from like palms to, can we understand where water has been, and like trace out what an environment's like just based on texture alone. But I know a lot of people down there were working on sound, and it was very cool. That has all kinds of crazy software that I'd have to learn from them.
Yeah, data sonification is a whole movement of its own, right?
Very cool.
Okay, so we've got some questions coming in. Tiffany says, what inspires you to find that spark in how to tell a story with data?
Yeah, that's a great question. The spark, I think, comes from just talking to people about the work. I know when I focused my thesis specifically on like, how do we construct this mentally, if most of us are never going to go to Antarctica, how do we know what it might look like? And so I asked hundreds of people as part of my thesis work, but when you hear the word Antarctica, what are you most curious about? I'm really excited about what is most curious to people. And if there's something in there that's like, oh, that would be exciting to visualize, or, and just thinking about what people enjoy all the time, like the aurora, like a different color, or Moret, one of my colleagues on that plastics project, he is the co-founder of Data Cuisine. And if you haven't ever heard of that, totally look it up. But Data Cuisine is like, how do we encode different data sets with food in a way that is it too charred? Is it too salty? Is there a different kind of chocolate filling inside the truffle? How can that be? How can we correspond about data or talk about data in a way that is, kind of adds that magical quality. We all wear things, we all eat things, we all like seeing pretty things. Like, what do we have in common?
Yeah, it's great. Okay, and Elisa says, what is the general planning process for your projects? Do you start with a message and then plan on how to visually or artfully represent your message?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I don't, as a chair of a graduate program, I try to tell my students not to solutionize. Like, you want to kind of iterate and see where, through iteration, like what is exciting to people. You don't just want to design for people, but like with people. And so, thinking about color, the Antarctic color piece, I mean, when I would describe that to people when I came home and they could see some of my like GoPro video from my hard hat, getting these creatures at night on deck, it was like, what? That's what you do? And the kind of the awe emotion. So it was like, okay, well, I have to do something with colors of creatures somehow. And I didn't know what that would turn into, or how I would kind of relate that to biodiversity and relate that to climate change. That came later. But on the plastics piece, I mean, there's so much cool science literally being published daily. Luckily, you guys do an amazing job as Scientific American, but that's just kind of hidden in all of these. This was one of them. We're like, okay, here's this table, these 5 numbers that could be visualized in a way that's really impactful. And so starting with a scientific paper that has a lot of impact, it has a lot of impact, and thinking about a way, in this case, we're like, ooh, here's this, open call for this National Geographic, data viz challenge. Could we do something with that through a very different lens? And where everybody else is focusing on ocean plastics, could we focus on like the land aspect of that? So I think you can go either direction, but I think being my specific mode is like coming up with 10 very different ideas that are very low fidelity early on. And then kind of talking about it with people, or honing in on what do they have in common, and kind of sculpting it into something that's more compelling is how I do it.
Yeah, great. So Ethan says, you talk a lot about large plastics, but what about microplastics? Have you delved into that at all? He specifically flags the pods of detergents, but lots of other microplastics to get into, and I imagine that has its own set of challenges around like scale, because they're these tiny things that you can't see.
Yeah, I mean, the nanoplastics are really something I haven't gone too far into at all, from like facial cleaners and kind of industrial scrubbers and whatnot. But for sure, what we were dealing with was microplastics, and all of them are smaller than, like, the vast majority, all of them together. The average size was much smaller than like your pinky nail. Again, like a 20th the size of the weight of a paper clip. Like, it breaks down incredibly fast, and it gets to the middle of the ocean incredibly fast, like from New York at least or Boston over to the middle of the North Atlantic gyres, like 35 or 40 days. So cruises on over there, and the sunlight is really bright, and there's not a lot of wind, and it just fries. But breaks down a ton of pieces that a lot of my colleagues actually have been studying amazing things about how they basically become these little like floating island ecosystems, very tiny ones for like different bacteria that shouldn't be in the middle of the ocean, like those related to like cholera and like waterborne pathogens and stuff. It's really exciting, and that they're different in like different ocean basins. Anyway, that the marine debris world has like vastly published and grown exponentially since I kind of stepped back from it in early 2010s.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, let's see. So Tina says she would love to create / instigate an installation like you did in Bali. Have you considered writing it up in a way as to encourage and aid other artists to produce their own similar specific pieces? I imagine that the film that you mentioned may go into that a little bit, but I guess more like the specific process and helping other people to start projects like that.
Yeah, that's a great idea. And I'll put the link, a link to the, I think it's just perpetualplastic.net. Correct me if I'm wrong, anybody. But we have a website that kind of walks through what we did there. But yeah, if you have any recommendations, let me know. Or let us know.
Cool. And then I like this question from Gail. What differences did you find in the children and adult reactions to your projects?
What I liked about the gestural interface, and I admittedly like am not an amazing coder. Like I came from the hard sciences, as I mentioned, into design. I had to like learn Adobe products and Apple products, and it was all a big like, you know, if I can do it, you can do it. I like was a non-internet, you know, ocean going person. And learning how to like kind of program this little gestural interface in a way that when anyone walks by, you know, images start popping up and they realize that they did that. And they're like, oh, I want to, you know, it seems kind of magical. And so kids immediately got it. And even at the children's hospital, when kids had like IVs in their hand, they were like moving them up and down. It was amazing. And, you know, I think from that perspective, I think it's pretty, kids will just stay there for a lot longer, you know. Adults are like, oh, is someone watching? Should I not be doing this? It's kind of like this, you know, anyway. So I'd love to see this in children's museums or something someday. But yeah, on the installation side of things, yeah, I mean, kids love getting outside and they love doing those kind of things. And if you can help them, you know, even think about a data set, or even think about encoding something with color in some way, or even if it's just a color collage with litter that they've like gotten off the beach, you know, they're super into it. That article that I shared that was from Green Teacher magazine has a bunch of ideas on how to engage people with, they had a whole kind of ocean issue on like but we wrote an article on how to engage different age kids with just knowing like even about, okay, well, if you cut up all your little pieces that you're about to throw away in the trash can, do some sink and some float, and like, what does that mean if it goes to the ocean? And so I feel like kids are a bit more intuitive. Gail, to answer your question.
That's great, thank you. Well, I think that's it, unless anybody wants to type in one last question. But that was so great, Skye. Thank you so much.